All right, let's pick up where we left off in the 30th word, God willing. So, to shed some light on this truth, before this, he was talking about the nature of the I, the ego. He explained how it's like a seed with two sides. One side, the prophetic view, gives rise to the tree of Tuba, and we saw the fruits that grow on its branches, the branches of intellect, desire, and anger. Then there's the other side, the path of philosophy. He talked about the poisonous Zakum tree that sprouts from that view of the ego and its bitter fruits. Now, to make this whole topic even clearer, he's going to give us a few more examples. To illustrate the point, he says we'll look at 3 or 4 examples out of the thousands we could compare. We'll contrast the results that come from the corrupt principles of philosophy with the results that spring from the true foundations of the prophetic path, the corrupt principles of philosophy. What does that mean? Basically, philosophy sets up these principles, these rules, but they're flawed. They don't have a basis in reality or in the universe. They're just things people made up in their own minds. We're going to compare the results of these made-up principles on our personal lives, on society, on our knowledge of God, with the principles laid down by the Quran and the prophets, the true foundations of the prophetic path. Because the path of prophecy looks at the ego correctly, it reads it the right way, and so it derives true principles and correct rules from it. Now he's going to compare them. He says there are thousands of points of comparison, but he'll just give 3 or 4 as samples. For instance, let's look at the guiding principles from prophecy for our personal lives. What kind of rule does it give us? When you look at the ego correctly, when you read it and interpret it the right way, what principle emerges for your own life? It's the principle. Adopt the character of God. What does that mean? It means to be imbued with divine ethics. This is an order from the Quran. So what are divine ethics? They are God's names. For example, God is merciful, compassionate, just, and wise. So a person should also strive to reflect these names, to be just, merciful, compassionate, helpful, generous. When a person takes God's infinite attributes as a model for their own life and becomes a mirror to those names, they have adopted divine ethics. So you adopt these divine ethics and then turn to God in utter humility. You turn to Him, but with humility, knowing your own powerlessness, your weakness, your neediness. You know your place and turn toward God's infinite majesty, acknowledging your weakness, poverty, and flaws. The principle is know your powerlessness, your poverty, and your faults, and become a servant at His court. We are powerless, we are needy, and we are also flawed. No matter how much we worship, how much we serve, we can never truly repay God's flawless lordship. No matter how much we give thanks, we can never offer the thanks He truly deserves. We always fall short. The principle is to be aware of this, to know your weakness, poverty, and flaws, and to become His servant. For example, in the 11th word it says, "Glory be to you, we have not known you as you deserve to be known. And glory be to you, we have not thanked you as you deserve to be thanked." A person expresses their own shortcomings like this. The principle is to be a servant, to be God's soldier, His employee, to enter under His spiritual command. Now, what does philosophy say? What's its rule for the individual? Strive to be like the necessary being. This is their principle. The pinnacle of humanity is to try to resemble the necessary being. Try to be like God. What an arrogant principle. You see, prophecy says, adopt God's ethics, but never forget your powerlessness and need. Philosophy says, try to be like God. For example, God has given us a small measure of power, some minor abilities, a little bit of sight. All the faculties of our soul and body are given by Him. The owner is God. So we say we must use them according to his command, and we become his servants. But philosophy says, no, these are mine. It thinks, just as God has infinite power, I have my power. Just as God has knowledge, I have my knowledge. It sees its own attributes as belonging to itself, just as God's attributes are inherent to his essence. Because philosophy is blind to human weakness and neediness, it thinks it is the owner of the things it possesses. And so, unfortunately, it thinks it resembles God. This is where it falls into a massive error. So where does philosophy's arrogant rule try to be like the necessary being? It's the peak of humanity. Stand in comparison. They've turned this into a principle, written books about it, made it a whole philosophy. We might think, what does this have to do with us? But even if we don't know the philosophy, every single one of us can have a share of this in our own little world. Even if we don't say it in these words, you can see it in a person's attitude, in their feelings. They try to make people admire them. They promote themselves. A person can easily start thinking that the things God gave them are their own property. At that point, they get their share of this philosophy in their own life. So we can't just say, oh, that's just some philosophy, it doesn't concern me. Every person might have a small piece of this inside them, and they need to purify themselves from it. We try to please God, to earn his satisfaction and his love. They try to please other people. So where does this self-promoting principle of philosophy stand? And in reality, how can it even be possible? The very essence of a human being is needed with infinite powerlessness, weakness, poverty, and need. That's what we are. How can a being with such an essence try to be like God? You can see right away what a huge mistake philosophy is making here. And where does that stand next to the reality of the necessary being who is infinitely powerful, strong, rich, and utterly self-sufficient, in need of nothing? A human needs everything: air, water, sun, soil, food, drink. But God needs nothing. So how can you derive a principle of emulating the necessary being? It's completely false. Second example, the principles of prophecy for social life. The principle of cooperation is at work everywhere, from the sun and moon rushing to the aid of plants and animals to the aid of humans, and even food particles to the aid of the body's cells. Where does this law of generosity and this code of honor and mutual aid stand? The sun is 93 million miles away, yet it works to deliver light and heat to living things on earth, to ripen our food. You see cooperation and generosity everywhere. Plants rush to the aid of animals by becoming their food, helping them live. Animals rush to the aid of humans. Right now, if we're eating an egg, it's because chickens are working to produce eggs for us. Honeybees are making honey for us. Cows are trying to give us milk. Even the food particles we eat, once they pass through our mouth, stomach, and intestines, God breaks them down into atoms. Those atoms are then sent wherever the body needs them. Calcium to the bones, phosphorus to the eyes. The particles of food rush to the aid of the body's cells. Without them, human life couldn't continue. They are rushed to our aid. When we drink water, it's immediately rushed throughout our body. So you see this principle of cooperation, this law of generosity, this code of honor at work everywhere in the universe, from atoms to stars. Now, where does that stand next to philosophy's principle for social life, the principle of struggle? And where does philosophy get this idea? From misinterpreting the nature of a few oppressive, monstrous people and a few savage animals. Not all animals, just the wild ones that misuse their nature. For example, misusing their innate compassion. Philosophy looks only at that and makes it the fundamental rule. The Quran takes the principle of cooperation from a law that is active throughout the entire universe. But philosophy takes its principle of struggle from a tiny, distorted sample. They have accepted this principle of struggle as so fundamental and universal that they have foolishly declared, life is a struggle. I mean, right now the sun is subdued for us. It appears to circle the earth, or the earth circles the sun. Did we make the sun submit to our command through struggle? All the trees give us fruit. Did we achieve that through conflict? All the animals have become our servants. Was that through a fight? The entire universe has been arranged in a way that we can live in it. Did we do that by struggling? No. There is a being who has subdued the entire universe for us, made it our servant. The principle of mutual aid is active throughout creation. To not see this is just foolish. Only a mindless fool could say such a thing. Does a person think they live like a king in this world through their own strength and power? No. If someone can't see that and says, life is a struggle, that is a foolish judgment. Third example, this is a comparison regarding the unity of God. One of the sublime principles of prophecy concerning divine unity is unity can only come from a single one. Meaning, since there is unity in each thing and in all things together, it means they are the creation of a single being. Where does this unifying monotheistic principle stand? In everything and in all things. For example, is there unity in the human body? Yes, it's a single indivisible whole. You can't just separate it into two. Think about the heart. All the veins coming from the heart spread to every part of the body. The blood circulates everywhere. So whoever created the heart must have created the entire human body. You can't just create a heart and place it there without seeing the whole body. The heart shows that the human is a unified whole. If we were made of separate, independent parts, then a different craftsman could have made each part. But a person is an indivisible whole. All our limbs and organs are interwoven and intricately connected. This means the entire human being came from a single hand. If there is unity, a wholeness in a thing, it is the work of a single being. The body is like this. The soul is like this. All humans have the same basic nature. There's unity there. There is unity on the earth. The air, for example, is the same everywhere. It creates unity on earth. The soil is the same everywhere. The one who created the soil must have created everything that grows on it. The light from the sun penetrates all plants, all things. So the one who created light must have created all creatures. There are signs of unity everywhere in the universe. So prophecy says it must be the work of a single being. Now where does this stand next to a creedal principle of old philosophy? From the one, only one can emerge. One being can only directly create one single thing. They were comparing God to a weak human who can only do one task at a time. Of course, you can't compare the contingent with the necessary, but they made this false analogy and fell into this flawed thinking about God. From the one, only one can emerge. Any other things must be created through intermediaries. This makes the absolutely rich and absolutely powerful ones seem weak and in need of intermediaries. It's like a king who appoints governors and assistants because he is weak and needs help. But God is absolutely rich and absolutely powerful. His power reaches everything. He doesn't need intermediaries. But because they couldn't see the truth, they imagined it this way. They make God seem weak and needy, and they effectively grant a share of lordship, the administration of the universe, to all the causes and intermediaries. It's a kind of polytheism. They give the majestic creator a single creation called the first intellect, and then supposedly that created something else, which created something else, and so on, with 10 intellects managing the universe. They came up with these superstitious ideas. They basically divide up God's kingdom among causes and intermediaries, opening the door to a massive form of polytheism. So where does this polytheistic, misguided principle of philosophy stand? It has nothing to do with truth. If even the highest class of philosophers, the Illuminationists, made such blunders, you can just imagine the blunders made by the lower classes like the materialists and naturalists. So there are different ranks among philosophers. Some acknowledge God, but have these false ideas about him. When it comes to knowing God and seeing the truth, there are high and low stations. The Illuminationists knew God, but they gave power to secondary causes. The materialists and naturalists, however, deny God altogether. They are a much lower class. If the Illuminationists could make such a mess of things on the topic of unity, what about the materialists, those who attribute creation to mindless, unconscious atoms, and the naturalists who attribute it to the properties of nature? You can imagine how badly they mess up. And in fact, the Master explains this throughout the RİSALE-İ. In the treatise on nature, he refutes the naturalists. There we see just how big their blunders are. Fourth example, one of the wise principles of prophecy is, there is not a thing but that it glorifies him with praise. This means that nothing exists without purpose. Everything is created with immense wisdom, in a way that praises and glorifies God. Based on this secret, if a thing has one outcome or purpose related to itself, it has 1,000 outcomes and purposes related to its maker, its creator. This is also explained extensively in the collection. For example, a tree is created. Why? It has benefits for itself and for humans, yes, but its real purposes relate to its maker. A tree is created to introduce and describe God, to show his power, his art, his artistry, his mercy, his beauty, his perfection, his compassion for mankind, to display 1,001 of his names. It also has purposes related to God's own divine functions. The outcomes for itself and for humans are tiny in comparison. For instance, the sun was created. Yes, it gives us light and heat, that's for us. But its purpose in demonstrating God's majesty, power and greatness, the goals related to knowing God, are far greater. Everything is created with many, many purposes. So where does this principle of profound truth and wisdom stand, the one that says everything, even a single fruit, has as many purposes and outcomes as a tree has fruits? And where does philosophy's principle stand? It says that the purpose of any living thing is for itself or for the benefit of mankind. Of course, if you don't know God, you're forced to say this. But this is like attaching a tiny mustard seed-sized fruit as the sole purpose for a massive mountain-like tree. I mean, a huge tree is created just to produce one fruit. It becomes absurd. God creates a seed, and from that seed, he brings forth a huge tree. One seed becomes thousands of seeds. Then from a single seed on that tree, he creates another tree that contains thousands more seeds. Now this whole vast universe was created just so humans could live here for 50 or 60 years. That would be like a mountain-like tree for a tiny fruit. It would be absurd. For something to be wise, its purpose must be greater than itself. So here too, philosophy's view collapses into absurdity. So where do their so-called principles of wisdom stand, which see the world in a completely meaningless and absurd way, a counterfeit wisdom that is actually wisdomless? This truth was touched upon in the 10th truth of the 10th word, so we'll keep it short here. You can compare thousands of other examples to these four. It is because of these corrupt principles and dreadful conclusions of philosophy that even geniuses among the Islamic scholars like Ibn Sina and Farabi were captivated by its superficial glitter. They were deceived by it, and by entering that path, they were only able to achieve the rank of an ordinary believer. In fact, an authority like Imam al-Ghazali didn't even grant them that rank, because they didn't know God properly, because they had a mistaken understanding of him. An authority on Islam like Imam al-Ghazali, who earned that title by refuting the philosophers of his time and preventing them from harming the Islamic world, didn't grant them even that. Then you have the Mu'tazilate Imams, who were among the most learned scholars of theology. They were also enchanted by philosophy's superficial appeal and engaged with it seriously, taking reason as their ultimate judge. As a result, they could only rise to the level of a sinful, heretical believer, because they made reason the final arbiter. As it says in the 25th word, addressing the Prophet, reason on its own cannot find the truth. But when the truth is shown to it, it confirms it. Because they made reason their ultimate judge, they ended up at a low level. And then you have famous figures from Islamic literature like Abul Ala al-Ma'ari, known for his pessimism, and Omar Khayyam, known for his forlorn cries. They savored the pleasure that this philosophical path offers to the evil commanding self, the pleasure of saying, I thought this, I discovered that, puffing up the ego. Because of this, they earned a slap of contempt and condemnation from the people of truth and perfection. They were told, you are being disrespectful, you are falling into heresy and raising heretics, and received a disciplinary rebuke. Another one of philosophy's corrupt principles relates to the ego. The ego, in its essence, is as weak and unsubstantial as air. When we say I, what is that? It's a fragile essence. If a person loses consciousness, they aren't even aware of themselves. It's that weak. Saying I depends on consciousness, and that consciousness is so fragile. That I isn't even a level of existence. You can't load anything onto it. It can't own anything. A person has a little bit of power, a little sight, hearing. They have many attributes, but they don't own any of them. The ego is too weak to carry them. But because of philosophy's wretched gaze, it looks at the ego as an independent entity. That ego, which was like vapor, supposedly condenses and becomes liquid. Then, through familiarity and immersion in materialism, it solidifies and hardens like a stone. Then, through heedlessness and denial, that egoism freezes completely. Through rebellion, it becomes murky and loses its transparency. It gets thicker and thicker until it completely swallows its owner. It puffs itself up with the ideas of mankind. It starts by saying I, then it starts saying we, as in we humans, and it expands. Then it measures other people, and even the secondary causes against itself, even though those causes reject and disown this role. I mean, plants and animals are unconscious, but the tasks they perform are so conscious that they are effectively saying, this is not our work. A bee makes honey, but not with its own consciousness. It's being made to do it. A chicken lays an egg with all its amazing properties, its shell. Is the chicken aware of this? No. It's not their work. God makes them do it. Their very nature rejects ownership. Yet philosophy assigns them a kind of pharaonic lordship. At that point, the ego takes up a position of combat against the commands of the majestic Creator. It says, who can give life to bones when they have decayed? As if issuing a challenge, it accuses the all-powerful of being incapable. He who created them in the first place will give them life. But it challenges this, accusing the all-powerful of weakness. It even interferes with the attributes of the majestic Creator. The things it doesn't like, the things that displease the Pharaoh-like ego, it either rejects, denies, or distorts them. For example, one group of philosophers called God compelled by his own nature, thereby denying his free will. They denied the infinite testimonies of the entire universe that prove his will. Can you believe it? In this universe, from the atom to the sun, all beings, with their distinct identities, their perfect order, their wisdom, their precise measures, all point to the Creator's will. For instance, the amount of salt in the oceans. If there were more, all the creatures in it would die. If there were less, the seas would start to stink. The amount is exactly what it needs to be. This means there is a being who willed this amount, that this precise measure happened by chance, and the amount of oxygen in the air is 21%. If it were 31%, fires would break out everywhere. If it were 11%, then we would suffocate. Who set it at 21%? Everything is at exactly the point it needs to be. This shows a being who acts with will and purpose. The whole universe demonstrates God's will, and yet this damnably blind philosophy cannot see it. Another group of philosophers said, God's knowledge does not extend to particulars. They thought, great beings deal with great matters, not small ones. With this flawed analogy, they denied the awesome comprehensiveness of God's knowledge. They were trying to exalt God, but it's actually a defect. If the sun can give its light to the smallest particle and the largest ocean, that comprehensiveness shows its greatness. Likewise, if God governs everything from the tiniest atom to the biggest star, this shows the greatness and scope of his power. They denied this, rejecting the truthful testimonies of all of creation. God's knowledge extends into the atom, into its nucleus, into the particles within that. He put order there. He runs the activities there with wisdom. How can his knowledge not extend to particulars? If it didn't, there would be chaos there. But we see perfect order from the smallest point to the vastest cosmos. So, his knowledge must encompass everything. Godless philosophy also gives real effect to secondary causes and puts creation in the hands of nature. As is proven decisively in the 22nd word, they fail to see the brilliant seal on everything that is unique to the Creator of all things. Instead, they attribute creation to nature, a nature that is powerless, lifeless, unconscious, and blind, with its two hands being chance and force, which are also blind. They give it the status of a source, and they attribute to it a portion of creation, these beings that express thousands of lofty wisdoms and are each like a divine message. And as is proven in the 10th word, they fail to find the door to the resurrection and the afterlife, which is pointed to by God with all his names, the universe with all its realities, the chain of prophecy with all its verifications, and the heavenly books with all their verses. They deny the resurrection and instead attribute a kind of pre-existence to souls. Some of them come up with ideas like reincarnation, because the human soul has a desire for eternity, and they have to address that desire somehow. You can measure all their other ideas against these superstitions. It's as if the devils, using the ego's beak and talons, snatch up the minds of godless philosophers, lift them into the air, and then dash them into the valleys of misguidance, shattering them. When a person trusts their own ego, their own mind, their own ideas, saying, I know best, I understand everything, I think correctly, they get carried away by their egoism, and then they get thrown into the valleys of misguidance and are torn to pieces there. Unfortunately, reason alone is not enough to find the truth. Reason needs something that shows it the truth, like the Quran or the RİSALE-İ Nur, in order to see it. Of course, we use our reason when we read RİSALE-İ. We don't set it aside, but we use our reason, the RİSALE-İ, and the universe, all three together. We try to understand with our reason, but we look at reality through the lens of the RİSALE-İ. Then suddenly, God shows us. But because the philosophers rely only on their reason, they can't see the truth. They are thrown into the valleys of misguidance and drowned there. In the microcosm of the human being, the ego is a tyrant. In the macrocosm of the universe, nature is a tyrant. As it says in the Mathnawi al-Nuri, I fought against two tyrants, and by God's leave was victorious over both. As we read and understand the truths in the RİSALE-İ, we see that we cannot attribute anything to our ego. We must attribute everything to God's power. And in the universe, we cannot base anything on nature. We attribute all of God's artistry to His power. But those who oppose this have been captivated by these tyrants of the ego and nature. The RİSALE-İ has shown that neither the ego nor nature has any power to create or any real effect.